Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Loretta Besson, and I am a retirement plan specialist here at Goulden and McCarthy. I would like to welcome you to our Financial Wellness Program series of webinars. I am joined today by Michael Minton, Managing Partner of the Long-Term Care Specialist Group, who will cover the presentation today on long-term care planning, what you need to know. We think this is such an important topic and gives us the opportunity to share valuable information with our clients. As a reminder, our team at Goulden and McCarthy is available to help answer any questions you may have regarding this presentation or your financial plan more broadly. In the interest of time, we will not be taking questions during this presentation. However, I will provide our contact information again following the presentation, and certainly if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to our office. And with that, I will turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Loretta. And thank you, everybody, for hopping on the call today. We have about 30 minutes to talk about long-term care planning. My name, as Loretta had said, is Michael Minton. I've been specializing in long-term care planning for 25 years, which I tend to joke is not necessarily a long time in the insurance business, but is certainly a long time in the long-term care planning business. So we bring some pretty good experience to this conversation, and we'll talk a little bit about how things have changed during those 25 years that I've had the pleasure of doing this. But in general, I want to quickly touch on what our agenda will be for today. The first thing I'm going to touch on is defining sort of what long-term care planning even is. And then we'll go through what I really consider to be the kind of the four steps. One, defining what long-term care is and the problem of long-term care. Why everybody on this call today should be thinking about planning for it. The third item that we'll go through is a little bit about what your options are to plan. And then the fourth step in the process is really giving thought to what's best for you. And I always write on here that it's personal because it is. There are no two situations that are exactly identical. There are no two family dynamics that are identical or emotions that are identical. So it's really important to understand that cookie cutter long-term care planning doesn't really exist. It comes down to what's important to you, and most importantly, we'll talk about sort of a mentality of getting the conversation started. Two major objectives today, and I think if we accomplish these two things today, we'll get you headed it sort of in the right direction. My first and most important objective is to empower you to have a conversation you may have been uncomfortable having before. This is probably the number one roadblock that people have when we talk to them about getting engaged in the process, right? It's an uncomfortable topic. The words long-term care, what they mean, what people picture, those items often prevent people from even starting the conversation. So today, ultimately, if we can give you enough power, if we give you enough knowledge to get that process started, we know that that will be a very productive use of the next 30 minutes of your time. And the other part is really just, which ties in, of course, is to start, right? To use this as sort of that push to have that next conversation. So as I mentioned, I want to start off by defining what long-term care planning is, and this is sort of how we would write it down in a textbook, right? Proactively developing a plan to protect your family, assets, and lifestyle from the high costs associated with a long-term care event. And I'll repeat that because I think it's important. Proactively developing a plan to protect your family, assets, and lifestyle from the high costs associated with a long-term care event. And you'll see we tie in sort of this protection of family, assets, and lifestyle, but it's also really critical to understand that costs aren't just financial, right? The cost of a long-term care event affecting our family can also be physical and can also be emotional. So that's why this planning sort of exists, why we try to get people into the mentality of being proactive. As we'll kind of talk about as we go through the presentation today, everybody on the call today has a plan, right? And unfortunately, the plan is by default, right? Things are going to fall into place the way that they will rather than by design. So we will often talk to people about, look, if you do one thing, start thinking about this planning process as having a proactively designed plan rather than one by default, which is already kind of being provided for you. So that's what we look at when we look at long-term care planning as sort of the job that we apply for when we're certainly helping our clients. Probably, again, the biggest roadblock that exists, other than getting the conversation started, is folks even understanding what long-term care is. And I know that might sound silly to some of you that have had a personal experience on the call today, but for many people, this is that roadblock that they just can't seem to get over. You'll see the question at the bottom of this slide. It says, what is the first thing you think of when you hear the words long-term care? And if I were to ask 100 people that question, generally speaking, I would guess I'd get 98, 99 of people would say, the first thing I think of when I hear the words long-term care is somebody lying in a nursing home bed in a very catastrophic situation, right? Completely dependent on their environment, probably receiving doctor's care and help with just about everything. And that's a very bleak picture, right? And that's a picture that would, of course, prevent a lot of people from considering planning, because that's something we want to avoid. That's something we don't want to imagine could or would happen to us. So I think it's really, really important, and this is part of that empowerment process, is to understand what is long-term care so that we can help other people that should be part of this discussion understand exactly what we mean. And the first takeaway, I think, should be long-term care is not a place. When you hear the words long-term care, I want you to be thinking about care and not where the care is received. Of course, long-term care could be received in a nursing home. That's what a lot of people think about. Adult daycare facilities is often a place people receive care. Assisted living facilities, as most of you are aware, has become a very popular option for a place that people receive care. And of course, people receive care in our own home. So right off the bat, I want us to imagine it as being care and not necessarily a place. The other part of that is, the other misconception that exists is most people think it's more of a catastrophic care, right? It's skill-based care by a doctor, an RN, or similar professional. As you'll see from this statistic here from the Department of Health and Human Services, close to 80% of the care that's received in this country today is actually community-based, outside of facilities. And 95% of that care is only help with custodial care or the activities of daily living. When we try to give people sort of a generic definition of what long-term care is, you'll see it on the slide here. We often define it as help with those things that we take for granted each and every day, right? Those are the things that when you woke up this morning to the point where you're sitting in a chair right now watching or listening to this broadcast, all those things, we got out of bed, we used the bathroom, we probably showered, we got dressed, we moved around, we ate. All of those things that we tend to take for granted, those things that we do each and every day, those are really the majority of the types of things that people need help with when we start to define the long-term care problem and start to define the long-term care situation. So I guess the purpose of this slide is just to kind of get us away from thinking about this catastrophic scenario and get us into the reality of long-term care really being defined as needing help with those things we take for granted each and every day. Of course, hospitalizations occur after strokes, after heart attacks, after medical events that do require skilled care, that do require nursing homes. We're not eliminating that as a reality for some people. We just want most people to be thinking about the fact that long-term care, A, usually begins very slowly, and B, usually begins in a fashion that just requires sort of these helps with these things we take for granted each and every day. Now, at the bottom of this page, we wrote personal experiences, and those are incredibly important to your own sort of understanding of the problem and what's important to you. Each of us has sort of a different experience, whether it be with parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles or siblings or even children when it's come to a need for long-term care. And as you begin to sort of reflect on your personal experiences, it's important to understand sort of your perception of how the finances were handled. What was the impact on other people in the family? How do we control that, and how do we take those personal experiences and go from a process of having them unfold in a non-planned manner to one that can be proactive? So those are the types of things we want folks thinking about. What would they want to happen if something had happened yesterday? And that's kind of the planning process, is to sort of draw that line and say, if something had happened yesterday, what would we want to see happen, and how might we control that process? We'll move on to, so we've kind of defined what long-term care is, and hopefully that part helped a little bit and sort of diffuse this catastrophic vibe that people get when they hear the words long-term care. So the next question is, okay, no big deal. People need care. People need care in different facilities and hopefully in their own home if that's what they desire. Why do we need to plan for it? And essentially these three things listed here identify the why plan, right? And one is going to be the risk that it could happen to us. The second is going to be the cost. And the third is going to be the available funding sources. Where's the money going to come from? So the risk is amazing. Again, the Department of Health and Human Services tells us that close to 70% of us are going to need some long-term care services during the course of our lifetime. I often talk about it as a 1 in 2 number because I like to eliminate some of the very short-term long-term care. But regardless of if we're talking about 50% of us or 70% of us, it's a ridiculously high number when we think about something that could involuntarily come in and affect our lives. Now, what's causing this high need, this high reality? Well, it's really driven by we're living longer, technology, medicine. All of those things are driving a longer life expectancy. And really the question comes down to the quality of life and whether or not some of those things that are driving it longer are necessarily positive. That's certainly another debate that we could have, but again, it's sort of become reality. What we do know is that many chronic illnesses, many sort of terminal illnesses have really converted themselves to chronic because of catching diseases and certain things a lot earlier than we were able to before. So that's certainly not a negative, but what it does is it sort of increases our risk over time. The cost is probably the biggest reason why we need to plan, right? At least from a financial standpoint. We have this enormous risk that it could happen to us. And the reality is, and I think most people on this call are at least in New Jersey or close to New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, maybe a little Connecticut in here, but we're in the highest cost region of the country by far when it comes to long-term care services. It's not uncommon to see costs in this area range from $50,000 to well over $100,000 a year for long-term care services. The next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about some of those more specific costs, but we have sort of this enormous cost that's out there. So we have this high risk that it could happen to us, and we have this sort of this very high cost. And the question comes, the third component here is, what are the available funding sources? And unfortunately, if we reflect on what's available to us for most people, and certainly most people on this call today, this care is usually paid for out of our own pockets. There are some short-term, long-term care benefits that come in the form of Medicare. Medicaid is available for those of us that are able to spend down our assets or who don't have enough assets and then become eligible for typically nursing home care through the Medicaid or welfare program. But generally speaking, the majority of us, and the number is close to 92.3% of us are going to be paying for long-term care out of our own pockets. So those are our savings, those are our 401ks, those are those dollars that we've sort of accumulated that were obviously meant for something else. So that in and of itself sort of creates its own issue, that there's just no miracle long-term care funding tree out there where we can pull those dollars off at $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a month to pay for long-term care. The government, there's bipartisan support to try to solve the problem in the U.S. government right now, but it will never get there because of the extraordinary cost that is associated with it. So that's sort of why we plan, and that's why people are motivated. All the statistics kind of line up to say, hey, it's a good idea to plan for this because of the risks, the costs, and how we're going to have to pay for it. I think the emotional side, though, is just as important. And for most of our clients, while they can relate to those numbers, they see those numbers and are concerned with those numbers, what they're really concerned about, though, is that a long-term care situation without a plan can have a catastrophic impact on their family. So they're much more concerned about the risk that it could have an impact on their family than really any of the other statistics that we sort of put before it. Right, and we kind of talk about the financial impact, that emotional impact, that physical impact. I'll quickly tell you, my parents were a really good example of two folks that ended up planning for long-term care, but they really did it for two completely different reasons. My father planned for long-term care from strictly from a financial planning aspect, right? There's a high risk this problem could come in. I want to transfer that risk to someone else rather than to myself to help protect my assets for my spouse and for my children. And that was his mentality throughout the whole process. My mother, on the other hand, planned for long-term care for two completely different. The first was she wanted to make sure that she was not dependent on her children. She took care of her mother for a good period of time, and while she would do it again, there was no love lost in that regard. Long-term care planning for her meant that she had the resources available to make sure that she didn't have to be dependent on her children. So that was critically important. The other part of my mother's situation, which I think is really important when it comes down to this whole planning concept, is she wanted to remain in her own home. She has always said she's sort of scared of that facility-based type care. That's exactly what she wants to avoid. So for her, long-term care planning had a lot to do with choice and the ability to kind of remain in her own space and not be dependent on her children during that process. She always will joke with me about it's okay if you stop by to bring me a quart of milk or to watch Jeopardy with me, but certainly not to take care of me. That's not what I have in mind. So that was really sort of the perspective that she came out at it with, and really what motivated her to plan. And again, men and women may often look at it very differently, but again, I think it's very personal, and it's very personal how it can affect us and why it's important to us. So that's why we plan. Here's a quick slide on some of the costs. I don't need to spend a lot of time here, but you start to get an idea of just how expensive long-term care can be on average nationally. This survey is actually from a couple of years ago, believe it or not. And certainly in this area, we can find costs to be significantly higher. I will note that nursing home and assisted living costs are a little bit easier to put a handle on, right? You can call a local facility and say, how much is it for basically room and board, right? And you'll have different levels within that facility, but it's pretty easy to put a handle on it. Home health care is a whole nother sort of problem, right? Because we have sort of no idea about exactly the type of care we're going to need, for how long, and really how skilled it's going to need to be. I mentioned earlier that long-term care generally starts very slow. It becomes difficult to do those things we take for granted each and every day. As an example, my grandmother long-term care began with It was difficult for her to lift the pot and cook and eat, and she needed to make sure that somebody was with her getting in and out of the tub, right? Those types of things were really how it began. It began very slowly. Over time, it became more difficult to do things. For her, she needed help at mealtime and bathing. That was 3, 4, 5 hours a day. That was really what long-term care meant to her. But over time, home health care can get much more expensive if you need people around all day as a live-in, and then the live-in level can go even to the next level if there's dementia or Alzheimer's involved, where you might need somebody up 24 hours a day or available 24 hours a day because of the safety issues that are created. So home health care, a little bit, presumably it's going to be less expensive, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And certainly people that want to remain independent, remain in their own home, they should plan for sort of that higher end of home health care cost, just to make sure that they're not in a position where they're sort of forced to move into a different environment. So let's talk about the planning process. What are your options, right? How do you, what can you possibly do at this point to plan? And we like to break it down into really 3 basic options, right? And ultimately there's 2, but the third one kind of becomes a combination. And we'll talk about the first one, which is self-insure. And the majority of you on the phone today, if you haven't ever done long-term care planning or had the conversation or written anything down or purchased insurance, this is kind of the plan you have today, right? We all sort of have self-insurance by default. That we know the money's going to come from our own assets, and we'll deal with it when we deal with it. And for some people, that's all they can do. That's all they can sort of handle in this discussion, in this process. What I want to impose on you is that if you proactively choose to self-insure, that's great. That's your plan. And what I would encourage you to do is get to the next level, right? If self-insurance is how you're going to do it, in other words, you've decided you're going to fund this care out of your own assets, I encourage you, for your children's sake, for the people who care about you, write it down. Make sure they understand that this is what your plan is, and this is where you'd like the money to come from, ideally, right? Maybe you want the money to come from savings that was earmarked for you versus maybe savings that was earmarked for the grandchildren or something else. You have to start to give some thought to some of those issues about what we might want to see happen. The write it down is really critical, and I tell you that because of the sibling issues and the family issues that are created, right? We had 3 siblings last week in the office that were fighting about where mom should get care. And one of them felt that mom should be in a nursing home that was up near him. The daughter felt there was an assisted living facility that one of her friends ran, and she would have a close eye over mom. And the third one said, you guys aren't listening to mom. Mom wants to remain in her own home. And I'll tell you, the fact that these discussions didn't happen beforehand was probably the biggest element of the problem. So we just want to encourage you in the self-insurance realm, that's really about just having the conversation about what you would want to have happen. My mom, as an example, we know no matter what we need to do, it's critically important for her to be able to remain in her own home. So if that means a second mortgage, if that means a reverse mortgage, if that means do whatever we need to do financially to make that happen, that's what her wishes are. So we encourage you to write it down. We encourage you to have those conversations about where the money would come from, how important it is to remain in your own home. The second option is to transfer the risk to an insurance product. And over the 25 years that I've been in the business, there's been an incredible iteration of different products that have been created to solve this problem. The early products were mispriced because they made some assumptions that that did not hold true, right? This was a new product, right? It's not like life insurance where the insurance companies had 135, 140 years of experience. We were really in a place where long-term care was in its infancy, and they were pricing a product without knowing a few things. So the very early policies were very inexpensive, and over time have become more expensive. But traditional long-term care insurance, which exists today and is primarily written by two primary companies today that we see, Transamerica and Mutual of Omaha, is still an excellent option for people to consider when thinking about transferring some of the risk to an insurance company. And you do that in the form of monthly benefit that's paid for you when you trigger a policy. We can provide you with a lot of information on sort of how to go through that process, how to analyze what a long-term care policy looks like. But they are really, today's policies that are still on the market are as consumer-friendly as they've ever been, appropriately priced, and can be a nice option for people to consider. Life insurance with a long-term care rider is something that's become very popular as well. And for many people that have existing life insurance, they've sort of captured a new way to turn that life insurance into a life insurance product, but with the option of accessing those death benefits for long-term care. And it's a pretty exciting trend in the industry because folks are really getting a nice opportunity to sort of repurpose their existing life insurance. For some people, it's a good option for them to just buy a life insurance policy that has the rider, but we also find this second option has become very popular for people with existing whole life or universal life contracts that have cash value in them. So that's something to explore, right? That's something to take a look at if you happen to own existing life insurance that really isn't earmarked so much anymore for a particular reason. The third option is what's called a linked product, and these have become very popular in the industry today, where you're sort of taking the life insurance and long-term care component and combining them together with the ability to get your money out of that plan if your plans change and you need the money back. So each of these three different sort of products each have their own value proposition, each have their own leverage in terms of how much they may provide in terms of coverage. I think the biggest thing that's changed in the marketplace today is 25 years ago, people, when they looked at insurance as an option to plan for long-term care, they usually bought a plan that was going to cover 100% of the cost, right? They wanted a program that was going to take care of everything. And the mindset that's changed today is most of our clients, we need to talk about having a base plan. We need to talk about something covering a good chunk of the cost, maybe most of the cost, but we don't need really in the financial planning world sort of this Cadillac program anymore. So we often go to number three, which is sort of this combination of some self-insurance and some risk transfer. And a lot of that has to do with budget. A lot of that has to do with ability to qualify. A lot of that has to do with everybody as an individual and what fits for them. And I can't emphasize enough how there's no sort of cookie cutter answer here. The real focus should be on, hey, is this important to me? Do I recognize this as a problem? Is this something I should at least be talking to my family about, my loved ones about? What would happen if? And from a financial standpoint, do I want to take a look at what some of these insurance products might mean in my overall financial plan? And again, each of them sort of has its own value proposition, and I encourage you to take a look at it and certainly solicit some additional information. Again, when we talk about long-term care planning, your job now is to say, hey, can I start the conversation within my family? Whether it's with a spouse, whether it's with your siblings, you be the person who takes that next step. It's not comfortable, it's not easy, but I think as we can tell from the conversation today, it's incredibly important. Talk to a specialist to discuss your options. That's going to be critically important, right? You need to talk to somebody who's been in this business, understands the different options, and can help understand how they fit into the other things that you're doing from a financial planning standpoint, from a retirement savings standpoint. Timing is everything. For some of you today, it won't be critically important to start this process, but we're out eating with our best friends for dinner over the weekend, and they start talking about mom's health is declining. I'm not sure what we're going to do. So it'll hit you at a different time. The importance of kind of getting this conversation started, while I hope I've motivated a few people to start it today, the importance will continue over time. And again, we just ask you to be as proactive as possible because we know ultimately that is what will help your family. My contact information, although you can clearly go through Goulden and McCarthy to get to me, you'll see my email is up there. That's mike@eastmainllc.com, and my telephone number there. I would encourage you, if you just have a question, just email. There's no, obviously, there's no cost associated with asking a question. Come on in, and I welcome anything that might be a follow-up that you wish was covered on this broadcast, but you didn't have the opportunity to ask. We obviously only had 30 minutes here, and we probably finished up about an hour of content. So I apologize for going quickly, but we hope this was beneficial. And again, please know we're here to answer any questions you might have as a follow-up. Loretta?
Great. Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much for taking the time to share that valuable information and content. As you said, that was a chock full of information packed into that 30 minutes. Sharing those personal experiences for me that you shared is always helpful to hear. Walking away with some good takeaways for all of us on the line here. And as Mike said, reach out if you have any questions. We're always available to assist you. But most importantly, think about that plan and start that conversation. So thank you all for joining today. As noted, this content will be recorded and available on our website. So if there are any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you, everyone.